So probably this belief goes back to as much as 1000 BC when they noticed that this constellation never sets and came up with this idea of an old lady with a precious cord and the 3 thieves who are trying to steal it. So there's a lot of very rich tradition of astronomy. We have studied, like I said, Gonds, Kolam, Banjara and so on, and I'll show you one common example of what they have done. So for example, again to stay with Gonds, who have the most extensive astronomy, what we consider as Orion is in fact considered as a whole series of constellations. So the belt of Orion becomes a plough, Taurus becomes the birds, and the Pleiades becomes a bunch of stones that are thrown at that bird to shoo it away. And they see harvesting basket, they see entire harvesting scene, because this constellation rises in very nicely in December, stays in sky till about March or April at night, and therefore they associate this with the pre-hunting preparation, and they see everything that they will need for harvesting in this part of the sky. Different communities have different perspective. For example, if you look at Pleiades, it is seen as a piece of jewelry. Banjaras were essentially traders. They moved around large areas, trading material until the railways came around. So to them, this Pleiades is a piece of jewelry, especially the one that is worn on the head. To columns, it's a bunch of birds. And columns are essentially people who live by the forest. They essentially live by forest produced through gathering. And for them, therefore, this is a bunch of birds. To Korku, who are essentially hunter-gatherers, this is a piece of minced meat and a delicious piece of minced meat in the sky for the fathers in the heaven to have. To Gonds, who are essentially farmers and probably have been farmers for more than 2,000-3,000 years, the birds are a nuisance. So this is a bunch of stones that are thrown at the birds to shoo them away to save their harvest. In classical Indian mythology, of course, in Greek mythology, there are 7 sisters. In Indian mythology, they are the wives of the 7 rishis who made the Saptarshi calendar, Saptarshi, and so on. So the same region of the sky is seen differently by different cultures, even within the same community. For example, Banjaras and Kolams practically live across the street from each other, but they have completely different idea of what the sky looks like. Then there is astronomy of civilization. This is an artist's impression of what Harappan civilization might have looked like. But at this stage now things have settled, people have wealth and they are worried about transferring their wealth to their children and so on. So all kinds of other things come up. So astronomical mythology comes up, astrology comes up, cosmology comes up and so on. And in the absence of other knowledge, the people who can do astrology, etc., start becoming very important and respectable. Many of the myths are reinterpreted, so Rahu and Ketu, who were snakes, now start becoming the points in the sky where the sun's orbit and moon's Earth's equator meet and so on. And so the myths also change their value. There is an interesting mixture now of religious beliefs, astronomy, architecture and so on, and you get the cosmogony of that period. Some amount of mathematical astronomy begins to rise at this stage. I'm going to skip this simply because we lack time, but in Harappa, for example, we suspect that we think we know of an observatory that would have done that. In some of the punchmark coins of that period, 600 BC or so, you actually get these little drawings with something in the sky which seems like astronomy, but in particular the thing of interest is the panel on the left side. You get a lot of them with a black circle and lots of dots in the sky, and that would remind you of Pleiades, because as the middle panel shows, moon passes fairly close to Pleiades, but that happens once every 18.5 years. So in the life of any king, that would be such an important event because it happens once in 20 years or so, that he would want to mark it. And you can see the coins that mark astronomy at around 600 BC period. Then there are more complicated ideas about who we are. So in Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, 600 BC, I think there is a big discussion between Yagnavalkya and Gargi about what the universe is. And it starts by saying that everything, the earth is wrapped around water, water is wrapped around air, air is wrapped around the sky, sky is wrapped around the world of Gandharvas, which are planets if you wish. The world of Gandharvas is wrapped around the Aditya, Aditya's world is wrapped around Chandra, the world of Chandra is wrapped around Nakshatras. Then from Nakshatras we get the world of Devas is the world of Indras, and that of Prajapati, and eventually the world of Brahman. And when Gargi says what next, essentially she gets scolded by Yagnavalkya for asking too many questions. But essentially you have this perspective, and except for the moon, the sequencing seems to be pretty good. For somebody who is sort of thinking and guessing and all that, the sequencing comes out quite well, even by modern considerations. Temples are a classical representation of our cosmogonical ideas. Temples come around in India around 500 BC as a reaction to the rise of Buddhism when they realized that stupas are an important place for people to gather. They are originally sepulchral. Again, Shri Kumar will show you more in detail. They have specific orientations and entrance window and so on. The architecture of the temple seems to be a natural extension of the megaliths, but they are essentially a representation of the cosmos in the microcosm. And there are basically two styles, Nagara and Dravidas, and things in between, which you can see in temples. The upper one is a Dravida style temple, and you can see that the outer stones are of the most, the outer Dwarpals are the most important part of the story, while in the Nagara style, it is the dome under which the god himself sits is the most important part of the story. And the way the temples are laid out, the way the internal structure of temple is laid out with various directions for various gods and so on, is essentially a symbolism of the great cosmos on earth, because you bring the father, the god who is staying in the sky to come to the earth so that you can worship him. So you recreate the cosmos on earth as per your beliefs and then worship him. And there are interesting things that come into it, which are worth looking at. There are, for example, other references. Again, I'm not going to talk about it because Aniket will talk about astronomy in Sanskrit literature. But because of the fact that Earth precesses, you can actually date some of the documents. There are some strange event memories which are, we don't know whether they are genuine event memories or whether they are speculations. But from at least Yajurved, which says vernal equinox and Kritika, you get the date of 2300 BC. Yajurved Vedang Jyotish says the summer solstice happened in Ashlesha, which gives you the date of 1370 BC. Lagada, who says that no polar latitude of Stravishta, which he gives you 1340 BC. Mahabharat, which gives you Saptarshi calendar, comes out in 1200 BC. And Parashara Samhita describes the seasons and their constellations, and you can date that to about 1100 to 1300 BC. So wherever there are good astronomical references, you can actually use them very well. The last part that I want to talk about, technological astronomy, I hardly need to mention this. This is the GMRT dish. So beyond a certain level of sophistication, when the culture begins to specialize, they have the technology to do that. You now start getting professional astronomers. These astronomers essentially spend a lifetime studying the astronomy, and all in its formats. A proper syllabus is set up. A student who is studying has to study astronomy properly and in detail. And depending on the capability of the astronomy, mathematical astronomy comes up. So basic sine functions, trigonometric functions, etc., come up around 500 AD in India, because the modern technology-based astronomy in India essentially begins around 500 AD, and then it becomes more sophisticated astronomy. In India at that period is called the Siddhantic astronomy, when Aryabhat, for example, compiles all the knowledge that was available at that time and creates the textbooks for astronomy. And the preoccupation of the astronomers for the last 1000 years is to understand where the constellations are, which are the planets' movements and so on, because you need exact timings for various ceremonies, and also in trying to create a model, and which is essentially a geocentric model about how the sun and the planets move around Earth and so on. They develop various algorithms to solve mathematical equations to see how the planets move and so on. And the first concepts of trigonometry, etc., are in fact seen at that time, and then it becomes more complex. At this stage, exact mathematical equations come up, important functions such as sine function are tabulated, eclipses are now calculated exactly. Aryabhat defines that eclipse is essentially the shadow of the Earth on the moon for lunar eclipse, and the moon coming between the Earth and the sun for solar eclipse, and he tells you why it doesn't happen every full moon and new moon, and all those theories come up. So proper classical astronomy comes up by then, and planetary locations are calculated because you want to set kundalis and so on. Again, Aniket, when he talks about it, will talk about it in detail later in the morning. So according to Bruhat Samhita, for example, there is a syllabus for who can be an astronomer. And it says that an astronomer should be able to do time division, planetary calendar, terrestrial calendar, solstices, eclipses, sun's daily motion and annual motion. It should be able to calculate the latitude and longitude of the place, starting with Ujjain as the zero longitude. It should be able to understand nakshatras and zodiacs, and it should be able to teach it to a smart person. The interesting thing is, astrology is not a part of it. Astrology comes to India later as a Greek influence, but essentially the astronomy that is worshipped at that time or studied with great sincerity actually does not require you to be capable of predicting your future based on constellations. Then the most modern form of astronomy, of course, pre-telescopic astronomy, is these Jantar Mantars. I'm not going to talk anything about it because Ratnashri is going to discuss these issues in great detail in her presentation after the tea break. But essentially the astronomy of today has come through this entire cycle of thousands of years of studies, and we now have different stages. We now have telescopes, we now have realization of multi-wavelength astronomy, we have advances in physics and other fields which we can now compare, we have satellite-based astronomy, and together we have a much better perspective, a much deeper perspective of the working of the universe than we had a few centuries ago. So just to revise, we have the initial phase astronomy where you talk about the sunrise position, you talk about settlement astronomies where you build megalithic structures to understand how the sun is moving. Then we have astronomy of civilization where they notice subtleties and try and fit it with their understanding. And then the most modern of technology-based astronomy where we try and understand how things are happening and why things are happening. You can actually take the period. What I have here is a table which I'm going to skip, but on the x-axis over here, you have how many years since a culture has settled down, and on the y-axis you see how sophisticated their astronomy is, and you will see that the civilization that is settled for longer time has more sophisticated astronomy, and you can actually look at how sophisticated an astronomy and say how long the civilization has been settled, or conversely how settled the civilization, and you can predict how complex their astronomy could be, because we have enough knowledge now to understand how astronomy evolves with time. If you want to map the period, essentially initial phase astronomy comes from 15,000 BC till about 5,000 BC. Settlement astronomy is between 5,000 and 2,500 BC. Harappans probably would have belonged to this astronomy, so about 1500 BC. And Vedic astronomy comes around that time. Astronomy of civilization is between 2500 BC to about 1900 BC. 1900 to 500 AD in India to 1500 AD in the West, but essentially after 500 AD, you have the technology-based astronomy, which then has brought us to where we are today. So essentially it is possible to use astronomy as an intellectual window to understand the world. The growth of astronomy occurs in various stages. These stages can be seen in various cultural forms, and combined with our archaeological data or literature data, we can actually say a lot about a civilization based on their astronomical knowledge, or based on a civilization, we can predict how much astronomy they had. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. We can have question and answer session. In case if anybody is interested, you can ask questions.
Or we can have it over here.
Yeah, or you can meet, meet the speaker afterwards. May I request Dr. Yashwant Gupta, sir, to give his concluded remarks?
Well, that was an excellent presentation, Dr. Vahia, and it was all the way from prehistoric times to the modern times, the evolution and history of astronomy and its interplay with the society and culture brought out in a very nice fashion. It was really interesting to see that as far back as 3000 BC, civilization in India was able to record important astronomical events. And I think this is something that we should both understand better and also advertise, because when we talk about historical events, for example, the supernova remnant that he believed was the event being recorded, people talk about the Chinese seeing a guest star 1,000 years ago, and this is 3,000 years ago. And if this can be proved to be a genuine event, and then it's really a landmark event. And it was really interesting to see some of the other examples that he brought out, which are really remarkable, and they really trace our culture and our history. And as he said, the sophistication of a culture is often decided by how advanced sciences have been, and astronomy has been one of the premier and early sciences in all cultures. And so I hope you've all been able to take back something of interest and something of pride in the growth of astronomy in India. So let us thank Professor Vahia once again for an excellent talk. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks. It's over to you.
Thank you, sir. May I request Dr. Yashwant Gupta, sir, to felicitate Mayank Vahia, sir. Now I invite Dr. Sharad Kunte, Chairman, Council and Governing Body, Deccan Education Society, to felicitate Dr. Yashwant Gupta. Thank you, sir. One important announcement. Immediately after the vote of thanks, there will be a tea break for only for 5 minutes, and we are starting parallel sessions at 11:45. There will be a lunch break from 1:15 to 2:15, and everybody is requested to be please seated for at 2:30 for